Oh no, that's a lot of feet.
Oh, thank you, Shell, but not thank you, Banana.
Ooh.
Audio check. And yeah, alerts are on this screen, but they shouldn't be on the other screen I'm going to switch to. Thank you, Ollie, for the raid. And thank you, Steph, for 46 months. Tier 2. Boo. Also, Tim is having trouble with Fedbot. Classic. Hello, Tim. Upgraded. Mumsy. Ollie. Steph. Ollie dragged me here from his dwarf basement. A nice. Yeah, I was indecisive on the start time, so I just went with autopilot because I didn't get very many votes, and most of the votes were for the later start, and I'm like, well, I'll still be going in an hour, so it should be fine. Hello, Super Bubble. I'll be back.
Uh-huh.
Everyone having fun while I was gone. A hype train is close, apparently. Hello, Hayoso. Hello, Copper. Thank you, Anonymous, for the biddies. What's that about the voice? Oh, okay. I thought it was a reference to someone else's conversation, but apparently not. Hello, Legamoof. R.I.P. in peace, hype train. But yeah, the alerts are on this screen, but the screen I'm going to be going to, the alerts should be off. So. Where are we? And as with yesterday, I'm basically just like playing around. You know, I'm trying new things, testing out concepts, testing out streams. This is one of the subathon unlocks, having Fedtime stories read. I might do a non-horror version of this as well. I'm not sure, but I thought that timing-wise, it would be fun to do some spooky stories for the Fedtime story reading. So we are slightly working on that to-do list. Technically, yesterday was a subathon stream too, so. And the Life in the Woods ones are also subathon streams. We're just not getting them done as quickly as I'd like. Did I? Yeah, I tweeted already. Oh, okay. I thought you were saying that in regards to deep voices in the morning. Hugs, Legamoof. And hugs, Mumsy. So yeah, in case you didn't read the tweet title or Discord alert, basically I'm just going to try to read some horror stories in a somewhat enjoyable manner to be listened to. So I'm going to be trying to do, like, not full ASMR voice or anything, but I'm not going to be replying to chat in the middle of the story. They're pretty short stories though. Like, I've got multiple short stories. So I'm hoping that I can tell a story, it takes like 20 minutes or something, and then I can talk to chat and then like tell another story, you know. And we'll just see how far I can go as far as my throat and everything. I've already had like 2 liters of water and multiple teas and multiple lozenges. And I've tried to avoid talking all day, but we'll see. And there's not going to be any flashing lights. There's not going to be any intentional jump scares. I might like scare myself, or, you know, the neighbor might slam the door or something, but so none of that. And I did get Sons to read through some of these stories ahead of time. Not all of them. I think there's one that he didn't read. Just to check for really egregious trigger shit. And as far as I can tell, the stories that I'm going to read are pretty tame as far as like that kind of stuff goes. So spooky, yes. Trigger, no. Hopefully. But these are horror stories, so a bit different than what I normally intentionally get myself into. So triggers beware. And these all are public domain horror stories. So they're old as shit, and they might have very old values in them. Tried to avoid some of that as well, but that might still be in there. But yeah, I think that's it. I think we're ready to go. Any questions? I should get the... Let's click on this. Click on this. Alright, and I don't have a button for this scene, so I'll just have to click through manually. Boo. Alright, let's have another sip of tea. Alright. Got the heart rate monitor on. I don't know why my heart rate's 104 right now. Yeah, I guess before I get started, I can also just revel in the fact that I threw this together in the last, 2 days, 3 days. Yeah, so that's a link to the public domain horror story website I'm using. It's not a specific link to the story that I'm going to read yet. And then that is a link to the music that I'm using, which is also allowed to be streamed. And the the video camera overlay and the tree background are both legal to be used, even for commercial use. So pretty pleased, including that and the transparency and color changing things I did with how this came out. Hopefully it's cool. Like I said, light ambiance, no real big scariness. So let's get into our first story. Get cozy so I don't scooch my chair. Here we go. So we're going to start off with The Phantom Coach by Amelia B. Edwards, which I think is one of the more well-known stories, but I've never read it or heard it, so... The Phantom Coach. The circumstances I'm about to relate to you have truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is as vivid as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years, I've told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and, having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I prefer to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season. I had been out all day with my gun, and had had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east, the month December, the place a bleak wide moor in the far north of England, and I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, and with the first feathery flakes of a coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather, and the leaden evening closing in all around, I shaded my eyes with my hand and staled anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills, some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, not the tiniest cultivated patch or fence or sheep track met my eyes in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on and take my chance of finding what shelter I could by the way. I shouldered my gun again and pushed wearily forward, for I had been on foot since an hour after daybreak and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile, the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened with the darkening sky, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlor, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We had been married 4 months, and having spent our autumn in the Highlands, were now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love, and, of course, very happy. This morning, when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What would I not have given to have kept my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with a supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. And all this time, the snow fell and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shouts seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on in the falling snow, until wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus through all the long dark night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail and my resolution give way, when I too must sleep the sleep of death? Death, I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when life lay all so bright before me. How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart, but that thought was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again, louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered? Or did I only fancy that I heard a far-off cry? I hallooed again, and again the echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. "Thank God!" was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" growled he sulkily. "Well, for you. I began to fear I should be lost in the snow." Then folks do get cast away hereabouts for time to time, and what's to hinder you from being cast away likewise, if the Lord's so minded?" "If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, friend, we must submit," I replied. "But I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I now from Dwolding?" "A good 20 mile, more or less." "And the nearest village?" "The nearest village is Wyke, and that's 12 miles t'other side." "Where do you live, then?" "Out yonder," he said, with a vague jerk of the lantern. "You're going home, I presume?" "Maybe I am." "Then I'm going with you." The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflexively with the handle of the lantern. "Ain't no use," growled he. "He won't let you in, not he." "We'll see about that," I replied briskly. "Who is he?" "The master." "Who is the master?" "That's not to you," was the unceremonious reply. Well, you lead the way, and I'll engage the master shall give me shelter and a supper tonight." You can try," muttered my reluctant guide, and still shaking his head, he hobbled, gnome-like, away through the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. "Is this the house?" I asked. "Aye, it's the house. Down, Bay," and he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute he had turned the key, and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked round with curiosity and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served, apparently, a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural implements, and casks, all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the center of the floor stood some huge object, gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth, and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw, to my surprise, a telescope of very considerable size, mounted on a rude movable platform with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate its size in the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument and asking myself whether it was not the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you," said my guide, with a malicious grin. "Yonder's his room." He pointed to a low black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in without waiting for an invitation. A huge white-haired old man rose from a table covered with books and papers and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" he said. "How came you here? What do you want?" "James Murray, barrister at law, on foot across the moor, meat, drink, and sleep." He bent his bushy brows into a portentous frown. "Mine is not a house of entertainment," he said haughtily. "Jacob, how dared you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the old man. "He followed me over the moor and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". "And pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same by which I should have clung to your boat if I were drowning, the right of self-preservation." "Self-preservation?" "There's an inch of snow on the ground already," I replied briefly, "and it would be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak." He strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It's true," he said. "You can stay, if you choose, till morning. Jacob, serve the supper." And with this he waved me to a seat, resumed his own, and became at once absorbed in the studies from which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Smaller and less incongruous in its arrangement than the hall, this room contained, nevertheless, much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless. The whitewashed walls were in parts scrawled over with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the uses of many of which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios. On the other, a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-opened door of a cupboard at the further end of the room, I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and a jar of chemicals, while on the mantel shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object upon which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I'd never seen, yet seemed it stranger still to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid those wild and solitary moors. Over and over again, I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than of a philosopher. Broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair. It had all the ideality and much of the ruggedness that characterizes the head of Louis von Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth and the same stern furrows in the brow. There was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened, and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose, and, with more courtesy of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. "I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir," said my entertainer. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiency of our larder." I had already fallen upon the viands, and now protested, with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman, that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed stiffly, and sat down to his own supper, which consisted primitively of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence. And when we had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me, said, "Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for 23 years. During that time I have not seen as many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who's crossed my threshold in more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of information respecting that outer world from which I have parted company so long?" "Pray interrogate me," I replied. "I am heartily at your service." He bent his head in acknowledgement, leaned forward, with his elbows resting on his knees and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, with the later progress of which, as applied to the practical purposes of my life, he was almost wholly unacquainted. No student of science myself, I replied as well as my slight information permitted, but the task was far from easy, and I was relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked, and I listened spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence and only thought aloud. I had never heard anything like it then. I have never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all systems of all philosophies, subtle in analysis, bold in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and, still leaning forward in the same moody attitude with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer. From practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity in the wire to electricity in the nerve, from Watts to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, from Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and the Magi and the mystics of the East were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious upon his lips as sequences in music. By and by, I forgot now by what link of conjecture or illustration he passed on to that field which lies beyond the boundary line of even conjectural philosophy and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, of those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, specters, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. The world, he said, grows hourly more and more skeptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fable all that resists experiment. They reject as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstition have they waged so long and obstinate a war as against the belief in apparitions? And yet what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firmly? Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimony so wide and so various, attested by all races of men, in all ages, and in all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savage of today, by the Christian, the pagan, the pantheist, the materialist. This phenomenon is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. Circumstantial evidence weighs with them as a feather in the balance. The comparison of causes with effects, however valuable in physical science, is put aside as worthless and unreliable. The evidence of competent witnesses, however conclusive in a court of justice, counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is condemned a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool. He spoke with bitterness, and, having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hands and added, with an altered voice and manner, "I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to state my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from that field of science in which I had labored with honor during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 23 years ago. Since then, I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me, as I have forgotten the world. You have my history." "It is a very sad one," I murmured, scarcely knowing what to answer. "It is a very common one," he replied. "I have only suffered for the truth, as many a better and wiser man has suffered before me." He rose, as if desirous of ending the conversation, and went over to the window. "It has ceased snowing," he observed, and he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. "Ceased!" I exclaimed, starting eagerly to my feet. "Oh, if it were only possible! But no, it is hopeless. Even if I could find my way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight." "Walk 20 miles tonight?" repeated my host. "What are you thinking of?" "Of my wife," I replied impatiently, "of my young wife who does not know that I have lost my way, and who is at this moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror." "Where is she?" "At Dwolding, 20 miles away." "At Dwolding," he echoed thoughtfully. "Yes, the distance, it is true, is 20 miles, but are you so very anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours?" "So very anxious that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse." "Your wish can be gratified at a less costly rate," he said, smiling. "The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Dwolding, passes within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due at a certain crossroad in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you across the moor and put you into the old coach road, you could find your way, I suppose, to where it joins the new one?" "Easily, gladly." He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, and, taking a bottle of whiskey and a wine-glass from the cupboard in which he kept his chemicals, said, "The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking tonight on the moor. A glass of uskba before you start?" I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like liquid flame and almost took my breath away. "It's strong," he said, "but it will help us keep out the cold, and now you have no moments to spare. Good night." I thanked him for his hospitality, and I would have shaken hands, but that he had turned away before I could finish my sentence, and in another minute I had traversed the hall, Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out on the wide moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead, not a sound, save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand, his shadow at his feet. I followed, with my gun over my shoulder, as little inclined for conversation as himself. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears. His eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day with surprise how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images and fragments of splendid reasoning, in the very words in which he had uttered them. Musing thus over what I had heard and striving to recall a lost link here and there, I strode on at the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Presently, at the end, as it seemed to me only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt and said, "Yon's your road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand and you can't fail of the way." "'Tis then is the old coach road?" "Aye, 'tis the old coach road. And how far do I go before I reach the crossroads?" "Nigh upon 3 mile." I pulled out my purse and he became more communicative. "The road's a fair road enough," he said, "for foot passengers, but 'twas over steep and narrow for the northern traffic. You'll mind where the parapet's broken away. Close again the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident." "What accident?" The night mail pitched right over into the valley below, a good 50 feet and more, just at the worst bit of the road in the whole country." "Horrible! Were many lives lost?" "All. 4 were found dead and t'other 2 died next morning." "How long is it since this happened?" "Just 9 year." "Near the signpost, you say? I will bear it in mind. Good night." "Good night, sir, and thank ye." Jacob pocketed his half-crown, made a faint pretense of touching his hat, and trudged back by the way he had come. I watched the light of his lantern till it quite disappeared and then turned to pursue my way home. This was no longer matter of the slightest difficulty, for, despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to. How silent and how solitary. A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head, and accumulated them at compound interest. I did my best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had but just been listening to, and to some extent I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though, instead of traversing a quiet north country highway, I were scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. This last symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I glanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light like the gleam of an approaching lantern. I had first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashed into sight, a light evidently parallel with the first, and approaching at the same rate of motion. It needed no second thought to show me that these must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seemed strange that any private vehicle should take a road professed disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of the fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment, and even I fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage between them. It was coming up very fast and quite noiselessly, the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost, and could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself that question a second time, for here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, 1 outside passenger, and 4 steaming greys, all wrapped in a soft haze of light through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up, the guard, muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters, and apparently sound asleep in the rumble. Neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travelers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outside air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. I looked around at my fellow passengers. They were all 3 men, and all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle as if absorbed in his own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. "The winter," I added, "seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could not distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. At any other time, I should have felt and perhaps expressed some annoyance, but at the moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation, apparently, of years. My attention being thus drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly and saw, by the uncertain light of the outer lamps, that it was in the last stage of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a condition of decay. The sashes splintered at a touch. The leather fittings were crusted over with mold, and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp, and had evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been mouldering away for years, to do another day or 2 of duty on the road. I turned to the 3rd passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in a deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repair?" He moved his head slowly, and looked me in the face, without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turned cold at heart under it. I turn cold at heart even now when I recall it. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back, as if in the agony of death, and showed the gleaming teeth between. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror, a dreadful horror, came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He, too, was looking at me, with the same startling pallor in his face, and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own and saw, oh heaven, how shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that none of them were living men. A pale phosphorescent light, the light of putrefaction, played across their awful faces, upon their hair dank with the dews of the grave, upon their clothes, earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were as the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy, burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beheld in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud, the ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by when I awoke one morning from a deep sleep and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued and give you, in half a dozen words, the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that had accumulated at the foot of the rock beneath. In this snowdrift I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds, who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull. The letters in my pocketbook showed my name and address. My wife was summoned to the nurse me, and thanks to youth and a fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a mere dream born of the fever of my brain. We discussed the question over and over again, until we found that we could discuss it with temper no longer, and then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago, I was the fourth inside the passenger in that phantom coach. Thank you, Squarker, for 14 months. Probably should have picked a shorter one to start. Tim, I have a question for you. Yeah, I need to drink more tea next time. What file type am I saving as? Here goes tea number 1. I'm going to have some fruit while we figure this out. Okay. There's multiples of those. Windows PCM? So loud.
.wav.
Yeah, I know, that's the one it selected, but there's like multiple .wavs.
The one from the bottom. There you go, PCM.wav. There you go.
Just figured I'd save after every story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
Alright.
Spooky.
Was it spooky? Not really.
About halfway through.
5 seconds in, you can tell what's going to happen.
Well, no, only after it mentioned about the carriage. It's like, no. was going to happen.
Yeah, but these are all written. This one was written in 18. Well, no, the person who wrote it died in 1892. This one was written in or published in 1864.
Wow.
In a literary magazine edited by Charles Dickens.
Cool. Did you hear the doorbell?
No.
Yeah.
Are you going to get me a tea now or later?
Yes. No.
Okay. I'm just going to have a bit of fruit, wait for my tea to come, and then we'll think about starting the next one. Or do I want to wait until after the break? Do I want to hang out and figure out and close this one? Which one am I going to read next? Oh, that one's a long one. Maybe this one next? But yeah, since these are all public domain, they're all written... A lot of these are written in like the 18 to early 19... Some of these, they don't say when they're written, they just say when the person wrote, or like when the person was alive wrote it. Oh, okay, this one was published in 1912. This one was published in 1884. 1892. I feel like I got very flustered and just went really fast. But I feel like I did pretty okay as far as mistakes since it was my first time reading it. And, you know, I mean, I mispronounced a bunch of things, but I feel like I didn't stumble on my words too much. I don't know if it's at all enjoyable, but I think hopefully people enjoy some of this stream. I just know I pushed my throat too much in that one. So I'll probably take the next one slower and have more sips of tea. My juice lid's gonna be so loud. There it goes. Can I read that? No, I can't read that in 10 minutes, I don't think. I could try. I might be able to. Oh no. Oh. Hi, Mousy. My ghost still has hiccups, apparently. Thank you, Tim. Oh, jeez. Chair, why you be so loud? All right. Get those tummy gurgles out of the way. Load up the lozenges. All right. So next we'll read The Conjurer by Richard Middleton. Certainly the audience was restive. In the first place, it felt that it had been defrauded, seeing that Sissy Bradford, whose smiling face adorned the bills outside, had failed to appear. And secondly, it considered that the deputy for that famous lady was more than inadequate. To the little man who sweated in the glare of the limelight and juggled desperately with glass balls in a vain effort to steady his nerve, it was apparent that his turn was a failure. And as he worked, he could have cried with disappointment, for his was a trial performance, and a year's engagement in the Hennings group of music halls would have rewarded success. Yet his tricks, things that he had done with the utmost ease 1,000 times, had been a succession of blunders, rather mirth-provoking than mystifying to the audience. Presently, one of the glass balls fell crashing on the stage, and amidst the jeers of the gallery, he turned to his wife, who served as his assistant. "I've lost my chance," he said with a sob. "I can't do it." "Never mind, dear," she whispered. "There's a nice steak and onions at home for supper." "It's no use," he said despairingly. "I'll try the disappearing trick and then get off. I'm done here." He turned back to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said to the mockers in a wavering voice, "I will now present to you the concluding item of my entertainment. I will cause this lady to disappear under your very eyes, without the aid of any mechanical contrivance or artificial device." This was the merest showman's patter, for, as a matter of fact, it was not a very wonderful illusion. But as he led his wife forward to present her to the audience, the conjurer was wondering whether the mishaps that had ruined his chance would meet him even here. If something should go wrong... He felt his wife's hand tremble in his, and he pressed it tightly to reassure her. He must make an effort of will, and then no mistakes would happen. For a second, the lights danced before his eyes. Then he pulled himself together. If an earthquake should disturb the curtains and show Molly creeping ignominiously away behind, he would still meet his fate like a man. He turned round to conduct his wife to the little alcove from which she should vanish. She was not on the stage. For a minute, he did not guess the greatness of the disaster. Then he realized that the theater was intensely quiet, and that he would have to explain that the last item of his program was even more a fiasco than the rest. Owing to a sudden indisposition, his skin tingled at the thought of the hooting. His tongue rasped upon cracked lips as he braced himself and bowed to the audience. Then came the applause. Again and again it broke out from all over the house, while the curtain rose and fell, and the conjurer stood on the stage, mute, uncomprehending. What had happened? At first he thought they were mocking him, but it was impossible to misjudge the nature of the applause. Besides, the stage manager was allowing him call after call, as if he were a star. When at length the curtain remained down and the orchestra struck up the opening bars of the next song, he staggered off into the wings as if he were drunk. There he met Mr. James Hennings himself. "You'll do," said the great man. "That last trick was neat. You ought to polish up the others, though. I suppose you don't want to tell me how you did it. Well, come in the morning and we'll fix up a contract." And so, without having said a word, the conjurer found himself hustled off by the vaudeville Napoleon. Mr. Hennings had something more to say to his manager. "Bit rum," he said. "Did you see it? Queerest thing we've struck. How do you think it was done? Can't imagine. There's 1 minute on his arm, gone the next. No trap or curtain or anything. Money in it, eh? Biggest hit of the century, I should think. I'll go and fix up a contract and get him to sign it tonight. Get on with it." And Mr. James Hennings fled to his office. Meanwhile, the conjurer was wandering in the wings with the drooping heart of a lost child. What had happened? Why was he a success, and why did people stare so oddly, and what had become of his wife? When he asked them, the stage hands laughed and said they had not seen her. Why should they laugh? He wanted her to explain things and hear their good luck. But she was not in her dressing room. She was not anywhere. For a moment, he felt like crying. Then, for the second time that night, he pulled himself together. After all, there was no reason to be upset. He ought to feel very pleased about the contract, however it had happened. It seemed that his wife had left the stage in some queer way without being seen. Probably to increase the mystery. She'd gone straight home in her stage dress, and had succeeded in dodging the stage door keeper. It was all very strange, but, of course, there must be some simple explanation like that. He would take a cab home and find her there already. There was a steak and onions for supper. As he drove along in the cab, he became convinced that his theory was right. Molly had always been clever, and this time she had certainly succeeded in surprising everybody. At the door of his house, he gave the cabman a shilling for himself with a light heart. He could afford it now. He ran up the steps cheerfully and opened the door. The passage was quite dark, and he wondered why his wife hadn't lit the gas. "Molly," he cried. "Molly!" The small, weary-eyed servant came out of the kitchen on a savoury wind of onions. "Hasn't Mrs. come home with you, sir?" she said. The conjurer thrust his hand against the wall to steady himself, and the pattern of the wallpaper seemed to burn his fingertips. "Not here!" he gasped at the frightened girl. "Then where is she? Where is she?" "I don't know, sir," she began, stuttering, but the conjurer turned quickly and ran out of the house. Of course his wife must be at the theatre. It was absurd ever to have supposed that she could leave the theatre in her stage dress unnoticed, and now she was probably worrying because he had not waited for her. How foolish he had been. It was a quarter of an hour before he found a cab, and the theatre was dark and empty when he got back to it. He knocked at the stage door, and the night watchman opened it. "My wife!" he cried. "There's no one here now, sir," the man answered respectfully, for he knew that a new star had risen that night. The conjurer leant against the doorpost faintly. "Take me up to the dressing rooms," he said. "I want to see whether she has been there while I was away." The watchman led the way along the dark passages. "I shouldn't worry if I were you, sir," he said. "She can't have gone far." He did not know anything about it, but he wanted to be sympathetic. "God knows," the conjurer muttered. "I can't understand this at all." In the dressing room, Molly's clothes still lay neatly folded as she had left them when they went on the stage that night, and when he saw them, his last hope left the conjurer, and a strange thought came into his mind. "I should like to go down to the stage," he said, "and see if there's anything to tell me of her." The night watchman looked at the conjurer as if he thought he was mad, but he followed him down to the stage in silence. When he was there, the conjurer leaned forward suddenly, and his face was filled with a wistful eagerness. "Molly!" he called. "Molly!" But the empty theatre gave him nothing but echoes in reply. Nearly did it in 10 minutes. It's a very unsatisfying ending, I'm sorry. We may never know. But I am going to go take a break. So I will be back. I'm back. This is a very quiet song. I hope everybody has got at least a little bit of a kick out of the setup for the stream, because I had fun. All right. X. Oh, wrong window. Oh no, there's honey on the side of my cup and I just touched it. I'm licking my hand so it's not sticky. Oh yeah, one of the more secret things that I did as well is I had to turn my mouse wheel onto like the silent scroll, the fast scroll, so that I could scroll through a story and not have like click 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 tap 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 whatever, like mouse button or keyboard sounds or something. I thought about using a tablet, but this is what I went with instead. All right. I'm gonna try to drink more tea this time, so you'll have to excuse me sipping my tea and breaking the immersion. All right, let's... Oh, maybe I'll blow my nose first. Ghost boogies. All right. There's a part of me that's like, I want to record like audiobook quality storytelling in one take. And then there's another part of my brain's like, you're fucking stupid. That's not what this is. This is me trying to read a story as well as I can in one take. But we can only do so much. It's unreasonable beyond compare to expect perfection in a single take when I also have throat problems and have not read these stories before. It's my first time reading these stories. I think I'm doing pretty good. All right. Let's go. Let's do this one next. This one's called The Man of Science by Jerome K. Jerome. Oh, wait. Before I get started, let's put some lip balm on. That might help me too. R.I.P. in peace, Max. Because he doesn't have food in his food bowl. Alright. Now I won't have to try and quietly lick my lips. Okay, The Man of Science by Jerome K. Jerome. I met a man in the Strand one day that I knew very well, as I thought, though I had not seen him for years. We walked together to Charing Cross, and there we shook hands and parted. Next morning, I spoke of this meeting to a mutual friend, and then I learnt for the first time that the man had died 6 months before. The natural inference was that I'd mistaken one man for another, an error that, not having a good memory for faces, I frequently fall into. What was remarkable about the matter, however, was that throughout our walk I had conversed with the man under the impression that he was that other dead man, and, whether by coincidence or not, his replies had never once suggested to me my mistake. As soon as I finished, Jeffson, who had been listening very thoughtfully, asked me if I believed in spiritualism to its fullest extent. "This is a rather large question," I answered. "What do you mean by spiritualism to its fullest extent?" "Well, do you believe that the spirits of the dead have not only the power of revisiting this earth at their will, but that when here, they have the power of action, or rather, of exciting to action? Let me put a definitive case. A spiritualist friend of mine, a sensible and by no means imaginative man, once told me that a table, through the medium of which the spirit of a friend had been in the habit of communicating with him, came slowly across the room toward him, of his own accord, one night as he sat alone, and pinioned him against the wall. Now, can any of you believe that, or can't you?" "I could," Brown took it upon himself to reply, "but before doing so, I should wish for an introduction to the friend who told you the story. Speaking generally," he continued, "it seems to me that the difference between what we call the natural and the supernatural is merely the difference between frequency and rarity of occurrence. Having regard to the phenomena we are compelled to admit, I think it illogical to disbelieve anything we are unable to disprove." "For my part," remarked McShaughnessy, "I can believe in the ability of our spirit friends to give the quaint entertainments credited to them much easier than I can in their desire to do so." "You mean," added Jeffson, "that you cannot understand why a spirit, not compelled as we are by the exigencies of a society, should care to spend its evenings carrying on a labored and childish conversation with a room full of abnormally uninteresting people?" "That is precisely what I cannot understand," McShaughnessy agreed. "Nor I either," said Jeffson, "but I was thinking of something very different altogether. Suppose a man died with the dearest wish of his heart unfulfilled. Do you believe that his spirit might have the power to return to earth and complete the uninterrupted work?" "Well," answered McShaughnessy, "if one admits the possibility of spirits retaining any interest in the affairs of this world at all, it is certainly more reasonable to imagine them engaged upon a task such as you suggest, than to believe that they occupy themselves with the performance of mere drawing-room tricks. But what are you leading up to?" "Why, to this," replied Jeffson, seating himself straddle-legged across his chair and leaning his arms upon the back. "I was told a story this morning at the hospital by an old French doctor. The actual facts are few and simple. All that is known can be read in the Paris police records of 62 years ago. The most important part of the case, however, is the part that is not known and that will never be known. The story begins with a great wrong done by one man unto another man. What the wrong was, I do not know. I'm inclined to think, however, it was connected with a woman. I think that because he who had been wronged hated him who had wronged him with a hate such as does not often burn in a man's brain, unless it be fanned by the memory of a woman's breath. Still, that is only conjecture, and the point is immaterial. The man who had done the wrong fled, and the other man followed him. It became a point-to-point race, the first man having the advantage of a day's start. The course was the whole world, and the stakes were the first man's life. Travelers were few and far between in those days, and this made the trail easy to follow. The first man, never knowing how far or how near the other was behind him, and hoping now and again that he might have baffled him, would rest for a while. The second man, knowing always just how far the first was before him, never paused, and thus each day the man who was spurred by hate drew nearer to the man who was spurred by fear. At this town, the answer to the never varied question would be, "At 7 o'clock last evening, monsieur. 18 hours. Give me something to eat, quick, while the horses are being put to. At the next calculation would be 16 hours. Passing a lonely chalet, monsieur puts his head out of the window. How long since a carriage passed this way, with a tall, fair man inside? Such a one passed early this morning, monsieur. Thank you. Drive on. 100 francs apiece if you are through the pass before daybreak. And what for the dead horses, monsieur? Twice their value when living." One day the man who was ridden by fear looked up and saw before him the open door of a cathedral, and passing in, knelt down and prayed. He prayed long and fervently, for men, when they are in sore straits, clutch eagerly at the straws of faith. He prayed that he might be forgiven his sin, and more important still, that he might be pardoned the consequences of his sin and be delivered from his adversary. And a few chairs from him, facing him, knelt his enemy, praying too. But the second man's prayer, being a thanksgiving merely, was short, so that when the first man raised his eyes, he saw the face of his enemy gazing at him across the chair tops with a mocking smile upon it. He made no attempt to rise, but remained kneeling, fascinated by the look of joy that shone out of the other man's eyes. And the other man moved the high-backed chairs one by one and came towards him softly. Just then, just as the man who had been wronged stood beside the man who had wronged him, full of gladness that his opportunity had come, there burst from the cathedral tower a sudden clash of bells, and the man, whose opportunity had come, broke his heart and fell back dead with that mocking smile still playing round his mouth. And so he lay there. Then the man who had done the wrong rose up and passed out, praising God. What became of the body of the other man is not known. It was the body of a stranger who had died suddenly in the cathedral. There was none to identify it, none to claim it. Years passed by, and the survivor in the tragedy became a worthy and useful citizen and a noted man of science. In his laboratory were many objects necessary to him in his researches, and prominent among them stood in a certain corner a human skeleton. It was a very old and much mended skeleton, and one day the long-expected end arrived, and it tumbled to pieces. Thus it became necessary to purchase another. The man of science visited a dealer he well knew, a little parchment-faced old man who kept a dingy shop where nothing was ever sold within the shadows of the towers of Notre Dame. The little parchment-faced old man had just the very thing that Monsieur wanted, a singularly fine and well-proportioned study. It should be sent round and sent up in Monsieur's laboratory that very afternoon. The dealer was good as his word. When Monsieur entered his laboratory that evening, the thing was in its place. Monsieur seated himself in his high-backed chair and tried to collect his thoughts, but Monsieur's thoughts were unruly and inclined to wander, and to wander always in one direction. Monsieur opened a large volume and commenced to read. He read of a man who had wronged another and fled from him, the other man following. Finding himself reading this, he closed the book angrily and went and stood by the window and looked out. He saw before him the sun-pierced nave of a great cathedral, and on the stones lay a dead man with a mocking smile upon his face. Cursing himself for a fool, he turned away with a laugh, but his laugh was short-lived, for it seemed to him that something else in the room was laughing also. Struck suddenly still, with his feet glued to the floor, he stood listening for a while, then sought with starting eyes the corner from where the sound had seemed to come. But the white thing standing there was only grinning. Monsieur wiped the damp sweat from his hands and head and stole out. For a couple of days he did not enter the room again. On the third, telling himself that his fears were those of a hysterical girl, he opened the door and went in. To shame himself, he took his lamp in his hand and, crossing over to the far corner where the skeleton stood, examined it. A set of bones bought for 300 francs. Was he a child to be scared by such a bogey? He held his lamp up in front of the thing's grinning head. The flame of the lamp flickered as though a faint breath had passed over it. The man explained this to himself by saying that the walls of the house were old and cracked, and the wind must creep in anywhere. He repeated this explanation to himself as he recrossed the room, walking backwards, with his eyes fixed on the thing. When he reached his desk, he sat down and gripped the arms of his chair till his fingers turned white. He tried to work, but the empty sockets in that grinning head seemed to be drawing him toward them. He rose and battled with this inclination to fly screaming from the room. Glancing fearfully about him, his eye fell upon a high screen standing before the door. He dragged it forward and placed it between himself and the thing, so that he could not see it, nor it see him. Then he sat down again to his work. For a while, he forced himself to look at the book in front of him, but at last, unable to control himself any longer, he suffered his eyes to follow their own bent. It may have been a hallucination. He may have accidentally placed the screen so as to favor such an illusion. But what he saw was a bony hand coming around the corner of the screen, and with a cry, he fell to the floor in a swoon. The people of the house came running in and lifted him up, carried him out, and laid him upon his bed. As soon as he recovered, his first question was, where had they found the thing? Where was it when they entered the room? And when they told him they had seen it standing where it always stood, and had gone down into the room to look again because of his frenzied entreaties, and returned trying to hide their smiles, he listened to their talk about overwork and the necessity for change and rest, and said they might do with him as they would. So for many months the laboratory door remained locked. Then again came a chill autumn evening when the man of science opened it again and closed it behind him. He lighted his lamp and gathered his instruments and books around him and sat down before them in his high-backed chair, and the old terror returned to him. But this time he meant to conquer himself. His nerves were stronger now, and his brain clearer. He would fight his unreasoning fear. He crossed to the door and locked himself in, and flung the key to the other end of the room, where it fell among jars and bottles with an echoing clatter. Later on, his old housekeeper, going her final round, tapped at his door and wished him good night, as was her custom. She received no response at first, and growing nervous, tapped louder and called again. And at length an answering "Good night" came back to her. She thought little about it at the time, but afterwards she remembered that the voice that had replied to her had been strangely grating and mechanical. Trying to describe it, she likened it to such a voice as she would imagine coming from a statue. Next morning, his door remained still locked. It was no unusual thing for him to work all night and far into the next day, so no one thought to be surprised. When, however, evening came and yet he did not appear, his servants gathered outside the room and whispered, remembering what had happened once before. They listened, but could hear no sound. They shook the door and called to him, then beat with their fists upon the wooden panels, but still no sound came from the room. Becoming alarmed, they decided to burst open the door, and after many blows, it gave way and they crowded in. He sat bolt upright in his high-backed chair. They thought at first he had died in his sleep, but when they drew nearer and the light fell upon him, they saw the livid marks of bony fingers round his throat, and in his eyes there was a terror such as not often seen in human eyes. Brown was the first to break the silence that followed. He asked me if I had any brandy on board. He said he felt he should just like a nip of brandy before going to bed. That is one of the chief charms of Jeffson's stories. They always make you feel like you want a little brandy. Excuse me. I think I'm going to take another little cantaloupe break and finish the rest of my cantaloupe before we pick up the next one. I'm glad that you can tell what's going on in the story when I'm reading it. I feel like I would have a hard time following along, but like I said, I've never really listened to audiobooks. And I'm not doing the best job, but I am trying. I'm actually getting through these quicker than I thought I would. I think I only have like 2 more picked out. One of them's a lot longer than the other, though. Oh, it's not a tiny bug, it's a piece of fluff. You need a couple blueberries too. Definitely putting my throat through a lot of effort the last 2 days. Might end up having a no talking stream tomorrow, we'll see. How's the music, by the way? That's good. I mean, I'd rather it be too quiet than too loud, but just a little bit of ambiance, a little bit of creepy. I tried to take out all the ones that were more driving and like, you know? the guy that released these songs, apparently he also does custom work. If you're in the market for some custom horror theme songs or soundtrack. Let's try this one, I guess. Let's get my lozenge back. Excuse me. I'm nearly out of tea again. I have to open up my juice. So that's ready to go. Oh, I have a cup here. I can put some juice in the cup. There we go. I don't have to worry about knocking over my bottle. Alright, so let's do How He Left the Hotel by Louisa Baldwin. I used to work the passenger lift in the Empire Hotel, that big block of building in lines of red and white brick like streaky bacon that stands at the corner of street. I'd served my time in the army, and we got my discharge with good conduct stripes, and how I got the job was in this way. The hotel was a big company affair with a managing committee of retired officers and such like. The gentleman with a bit of money in the concern, and nothing to do but fidget about it, and my late colonel was one of them. He was a good-tempered as man as ever stepped when his will wasn't crossed, and when I was asked him for a job, Mole, he says, "You're a very fine man to work the lift at our big hotel. Soldiers are civil and businesslike, and the public like 'em only second best to sailors. We've had to give our last man the sack, and you can take his place." I liked my work well enough, and my pay, and kept my place a year, and I should have been there still if it hadn't been for a circumstance. But don't let me anticipate. Ours was a hydraulic lift, none of them rickety things swung up like a Paul Parrot's cage in a well staircase that I shouldn't care to trust my neck to. It ran as smooth as oil, a child might have worked it, and safe as standing on the ground. Instead of being stuck full of advertisements like an omnibus, we'd mirrors in it, and the ladies would look at themselves and pat their hair and set their mouths when I was taking 'em downstairs dressed of an evening. It was a little sitting room with red velvet cushion to sit on, and you'd nothing to do but get into it, and it'd float you up or float you down light as a bird. All the visitors used the lift one time or another, going up or coming down. Some of them was French, and they called the lift the ascenseur, and good enough for them in their language, no doubt. But why the Americans, they can speak English when they choose and are always finding out ways of doing things quicker than other folks, should waste time and breath calling a lift an elevator, I can't make out. I was in charge of the lift from noon till midnight, but that time the theater and dining out folks had come in, and anyone returning late walked upstairs, for my day's work was done. One of the porters worked the lift till I came on duty in the morning, but before 12 there was nothing particular going on, and not much till after 2 o'clock. Then it was pretty hot work with visitors going up and down constant, and the electric bell ringing you from one floor to another like a house on fire. Then came a quiet spell while dinner was on, and I'd sit down comfortable in the lift and read my paper. Only I mightn't smoke. But nobody else might neither, and I had to ask furrin gentlemen to please not smoke in it. It was against the rule. I hadn't so often to tell English gentlemen. They're not like foreigners that seem as if their cigars was glued to their lips. I always noticed faces as folks get into the lift, for I've sharp sight and a good memory, and none of them visitors needed to tell me twice where to take them. I knew them, and I knew their floor as well as they did themselves. It was in November that Colonel Saxby came to the Empire Hotel. I noticed him particularly because you could see at once that he was a soldier. He was a tall, thin man, about 50, with a hawk nose, keen eyes, and a grey mustache, and walked stiff from a gunshot wound in the knee. But what I noticed most was the scar of a saber cut across the right of his face. As he got into the lift to go to his room on the 4th floor, I thought what a difference there is among officers. Colonel Saxby put me in mind of a telegraph post for height and thinness, and my old colonel was like a barrel in uniform, but a brave soldier and a gentleman all the same. Colonel Saxby's room was number 210, just opposite the glass door leading to the lift, and every time I stopped on the 4th floor, number 210 stared me in the face. The colonel used to go up in the lift every day regular, though he never came down in it till... But I'm coming to that presently. Sometimes, when he was alone in the lift, he'd speak to me. He'd ask me in what regiment I'd served, and said he knew the officers in it. But I can't say he was comfortable to talk to. There was something stand-off about him, and he always seemed deep in his own thoughts. He never sat down in the lift. Whether it was empty or full, he stood bolt upright under the lamp, where the light fell on his pale face and scarred cheek. One day in February, I didn't take the colonel up in the lift, and as he was regular as clockwork, I noticed it, but I supposed he'd gone away for a few days, and I thought no more about it. Whenever I stopped on the 4th floor and the door of 210 was shut, and as he often left it open, I made sure the colonel was away. At the end of a week, I heard a chambermaid say that Colonel Saxby was ill, so, thinks I, that's why he hasn't been in the lift lately. It was a Tuesday night, and I had been uncommonly busy time of it. It was one stream of traffic up and down, and so it went the whole evening. It was on the strike of midnight, and I was about to put out the light on the lift, lock the door, and leave the key in the office for the man in the morning, when the electric bell rang out sharp. I looked at the dial, and saw I was wanted on the 4th floor. It struck 12 as I stepped into the lift. As I passed the 2nd and 3rd floors, I wondered who it was that had rung so late, and thought it must be a stranger that didn't know the rule of the house. But when I stopped at the 4th floor and flung open the door of the lift, Colonel Saxby was standing there, wrapped in a military cloak. The door of his room was shut behind him, for I read the number on it. I thought he was ill in bed, and ill enough he looked, but he had his hat on, and what could a man that had been in bed 10 days want with going out on a winter midnight? I don't think he saw me, but when I'd set the lift in motion, I looked at him standing under the lamp, with the shadow of his hat hiding his eyes, and the light full on the lower part of his face, that was deadly pale, the scar on his cheek showing still paler. "Glad to see you're better, sir," said I, but he said nothing, and I didn't like to look at him again. He stood like a statue with his cloak about him, and I was downright glad when I opened the door of the lift for him to step out into the hall. I saluted as he got out, and he went past me towards the front door. "The colonel wants to go out," I said to the porter who stood staring, and he opened the door and Colonel Saxby walked out into the snow. "That's a queer go," he said. "It is," said I. "I don't like the colonel's looks. He doesn't seem himself at all. He's ill enough to be in his bed, and there he has gone out on a night like this. Anyway, he's got a famous cloak to keep him warm. I say, supposing he's gone to a fancy ball and we got that cloak on to hide his dress," said the porter, laughing uneasily, for we both felt queerer than we cared to say, and as we spoke there came a loud ring at the doorbell. "No more passengers for me," I said, and I was really putting the light out this time, when Joe opened the door, and 2 gentlemen entered that I knew at a glance were doctors. One was tall, and the other was short and stout, and they both came to the lift. Sorry, gentlemen, but it's against the rule for the lift to go up after midnight. Nonsense, said the stout gentleman. It's only just past 12, and a matter of life and death. Take us up at once to the 4th floor. And they were in the lift like a shot. So up we went, and when I opened the door, they walked straight to number 10. A nurse came out to meet them, and the stout doctor said, No change for the worse, I hope. And I heard her reply, The patient died 5 minutes ago, sir. Though I'd no business to speak, that was more than I could stand. I followed the doctors to the door and said, There's been some mistake here, gentlemen. I took the colonel down in the lift since the clock struck 12, and he went out. The stout doctor said sharply, A case of mistaken identity. It was someone else you took for the colonel. Begging your pardon, gentlemen, it was the colonel himself, and the night porter that opened the front door for him knew him as well as me. He was dressed for a night like this, with his military cloak wrapped round him. Step in and see for yourself, said the nurse. I followed the doctor into the room, and there lay Colonel Saxby, looking just as I had seen him a few minutes before. There he lay, dead as his forefathers, and the great cloak spread over the bed to keep him warm, that he would feel heat and cold no more. I never slept that night. I sat up with Joe, expecting every minute to hear the colonel ringing the front doorbell. Next day, every time the bell for the lift rang sharp and sudden, the sweat broke out on me, and I shook again. I felt as bad as I did the first time I was in action. Me and Joe told the manager all about it, and he said we'd been dreaming, but, said he, Mind you don't talk about it, or the house will be empty in a week. The colonel's coffin was smuggled into the house the next night. Me and the manager and the undertaker's men took it up in the lift, and it lay right across it, and not an inch to spare. They carried it into number 210, and while I waited for them to come out again, a queer feeling came over me. Then the door opened softly, and 4 men carried out the long coffin straight across the passage, and set it down with its foot towards the door of the lift, and the manager looked round for me. I can't do it, sir, I said. I can't take the colonel down again. I took him down at midnight yesterday, and that was enough for me. Push it in, said the manager, speaking short and sharp, and they ran the coffin into the lift without a sound. The manager got in last, and before he closed the door, he said, Mole, you've worked this lift for the last time, it strikes me. And I had, for I wouldn't have stayed on at the Empire Hotel after what had happened. Not if they doubled my wages. And me and the night porter left together. Apparently we've had at least one person ring our doorbell, even though our house does not look like there's anyone in it. And I've definitely heard more fireworks as well. I'll probably just finish this. AC413. Yeah. This is the one day a year that you're allowed fireworks over here, apparently. It's like firecrackers and stuff. I know you know it's fake. No. Boo. Oh, Lagamoof, that's so on brand for these stories. The camera died 2 hours ago. Oh. Yeah, I'm noticing a trend with these stories. Sorry, I didn't like vet them all and find them all with different endings, but you know. I'm having a good time even if I'm straining my throat. Must be weird how much my chibi is like facing to the our right, her left. Because I'm always looking at like chat. Like in this position. I feel like maybe I should procrastinate for 10 minutes and then try to read one more long story and then maybe end early after that. I don't know. Excuse me. Have I hiccuped during any of the stories? Oh my god. So all I need to do is tell horror stories forever and I'll never hiccup. We found it. It's the answer to this hiccup curse. But yeah, I don't know. I don't want to like promise anything here, but like what I was saying with Tim at the beginning, I am recording me telling these stories in a separate program as well that won't have the music in the background. So hypothetically, we might be able to edit those a little bit and cut out some of the before and after and just put it all together and have a possibly higher quality file, higher quality audio file of all the stories for people to listen to or download later. That's the thought anyways. We'll see how it goes. Like I said, trying things out for other... It's always trying different things and seeing how they go and all that. Actually, that's one thing I can do for 5 seconds to procrastinate. I can mark off the Fed-time story reading as done on the big list of streams I need to do for subathon stuff. I have this bad habit lately of like half completing something. So I'm like, oh, I did it, but I still need to do more. And it's like, I'm never going to complete all these streams if I keep being like, oh, I need to do it again. I don't think I did a good enough job. Or, oh, we're only halfway done. I need to do a second part. I hear tea coming. Thank you, Tim. Maybe I should just go on my break early. I got honey on my finger again. Eh. Yeah, I was waiting for someone to make binary jokes. Like, oh, you've only had 22 hiccups. Because that's how it reads or something. I don't know. This does sound really quiet, but it might just be because I've turned down my headphones. Might just be an extra quiet song. Oh, I was close, Lagamove. Not really, but kind of. Yeah, maybe I'll just take my break a couple minutes early. And then I'll try to do one more big story. And then I might call it early then, depending on how my throat is. Either way, I will be back. I'm back. I didn't have any snack, however. So I'm gonna eat this orange before we get started. I guess you can also speculate on what I'm doing while I was on my break because you have my heart rate. Oh, are you saying it doesn't work good? Why? I think the ones on the arms are less accurate than different ones, but it's strapped on my arm, if that's what you're wondering. I don't know how it works. I can give you a link to the one I have. I don't know how accurate it is. Then again, I've never really kept track of my heart rate. But yeah, on my break, Tim came back in the room. And then the door opened on its own. And behind the door was a black cat. Ooh. Tim didn't know, but Pixie followed him upstairs. And then I went in the fridge and I got out chicken and I put it on a plate and she ate all of it. Woo! Yeah, when we went downstairs, she was basically like, my bowl is empty, give me food. And then instead of giving her food, I gave her chicken, and then I gave her food, and then she's like, I don't want this food, I'm only eating the chicken. But she really doesn't know how to nuzzle. Whenever she tries to like nuzzle your leg, she'll basically rub her head on your foot and then like fall with her back into your leg. Like her butt will hit your leg, her head will hit your foot, and then she'll like almost fall over and then she'll stand up again because she doesn't know what she's doing. Also, she's scared of jumping on beds, as far as we can tell so far. She doesn't like being on beds or couches, so I think she's been taught that that's a no-no. I think the one time she tried to jump on a bed, she missed, and then she, like, licked her butt and was like, I meant to do that. But as far as I know, Pixie's outside with Tim right now. We haven't seen her much the last couple days. Trying to eat these pieces of orange very quickly, but they're very bitter and they keep getting stuck in my teeth. Yeah, like she tried, basically Tim was sitting on his bed and he moved his phone or something because it was beside him so that there was space if she wanted to jump up, and she like leapt and then undershot and just like didn't even touch the bed and just kind of fell on the floor and then licked herself. Like, yep, that's what I was doing. I was just doing a running leap into an ass licking. Well, she's really good at jumping on the kitchen counter. She's also really good at jumping on where the cat bed thing is in the garden shed. She's extremely good at jumping into the air and catching flies and bees mid-flight and eating them. Yeah, she'll eat bees. I've tried stopping her before when I see her do it, but she's just so quick. If she sees a flying bug, she will leap in the air, grab it with her paws, and then just mow down on it. And I don't know if I should be sad because it means that she's like needs the sustenance, or if she just really likes murdering bugs. Almost done this orange stuff. I say orange stuff because it's like slices of orange, but also the orange was kind of half bad. So it's like half slices of orange. It's very messy. Hey, omega-13. Actually, I might just finish this piece and not finish those because they're kind of squishy. Tomorrow is fridge day, I think. Maybe. Oh, that tea is too hot. I'll have some juice to take my pills. But yeah, she's like 2 years old or something, so I guess like to me she's still a kitten. I don't know when a cat is deemed to be fully adult. I think she's been like getting into someone's house, maybe her own house at night, and so she hasn't been let out as much lately because it's cold. I don't know. She hasn't been around as much. Oh, that was noisy. Excuse me. Alright, I'm gonna have a piece of chocolate and then put my lozenge back in and read one more story. Yeah, I mean, like, I know they can have kittens earlier than that, but I feel like they're not, like, mature mentally. They might be mature physically, but I feel like it takes them a while to, like, learn stuff, you know? Mm-hmm. Oh no, I think I had one that has like bits in it, so I'm gonna have bits stuck in my teeth. No! I just grabbed a random Quality Street that didn't look like one with caramel in it. It was like the loudest chewing in the world. I'm sorry. It definitely had like coconut in it. Aw, Chloe. Yeah, I'll have to keep trying to record Pixie's purr. I've tried a couple times. I've only heard her purr like twice. But her purr is so quiet. It's it's really sad that it seems like she's not very good at purring. She's not very good at cuddling. She doesn't like being picked up. She doesn't know how to nuzzle. Like, she was bought as a kitten and owned by like a teenager. You would think that she was well, conditioned to enjoy being touched and loved. But it doesn't seem like she is. Oh my god, itchy nose. I'm sorry. I won't say your name again. Alright. Oh my god, please. Keep trying to say alright, and then like my throat would get all itchy tickly and I'd want to cough. Lozenge time. Much many lozenges. So glad I bought like 60 boxes of lozenges last year. Alright. Let's get the tea in place. Top up the juice. Was it last year or year before last year? Yeah, it was something I depend on daily, so I wanted to make sure I had a lot just in case I had trouble getting it again. Alright. Got the tea. Get the new recording set up. Got the lozenges. I hear banging noises, but I don't know if that's just Tim. All right. Let's get cozy. Pixie? Oh, are you playing with Pixie? Oh, Pixie's in your room. Oh. Share. Oh, attacking your door. Why? Sent a pic. Oh. Oh, okay. Yeah, there's like a carpet thing on the back of the door. And she's probably grabbing on that and then letting go, and it's banging on the door because there's like wood on the bottom. It's one of the like panels we had for when I was doing ASMR recordings. Sounds like she's having a good time. Nope. Here start the fireworks. Alright. Well, if I'm not going to get any pixie, then I guess I will blow my nose and then start. It's funny some of the weird like facial expressions the chibi tries to do when I like blow my nose or cover my mouth. Alright. So let's do The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is a longer one. Every night in the year, 4 of us sat in the small parlor of the George at Debenham, the undertaker and the landlord, and Fetz and myself. Sometimes there would be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow or frost, we 4 would each be planted in his own particular armchair. Fetz was an old drunken Scotchman, a man of education obviously, and a man of some property, since he lived in idleness. He'd come to Debenham years ago, while still young, and by a mere continuance of living had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue camlet cloak was a local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlor at the George, his absence from church, his old, crapulous, disreputable vices were all things of course in Debenham. He had some vague radical opinions and some fleeting infidelities which he would now and again set forth and emphasize with tottering slaps upon the table. He drank rum, 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George sat, with his glass in his right hand, in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. We called him the doctor, for he was supposed to have some special knowledge of medicine, and had been known, upon a pinch, to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation. But beyond these slight particulars, we had no knowledge of his character and antecedents. One dark winter night, it had struck 9 some time before the landlord joined us. There was a sick man in the George. A great neighbouring proprietor suddenly struck down with apoplexy on his way to Parliament, and the great man's still greater London doctor had been telegraphed to his bedside. It was the first time that such a thing had happened in Debenham, for the railway was but newly open, and we were all proportionately moved by the occurrence. "He's come," said the landlord, after he'd filled and lighted his pipe. "He?" said I. "Who?" "Not the doctor." "Himself," replied our host. "What's his name?" "Dr. McFarlane," said the landlord. Fetz was far through his 3rd tumbler, stupidly fuddled, now nodding over, now staring mazily around him, but at the last word he seemed to awaken, and repeated the name McFarlane twice, quietly enough the first time, but with sudden emotion at the second. Yes, said the landlord. That's his name, Dr. Wolfe McFarlane. Fetz became instantly sober. His eyes awoke. His voice became clear, loud, and steady. His language forcible and earnest. We were all startled by the transformation, as if a man had risen from the dead. I beg your pardon, he said. I am afraid I have not been paying much attention to your talk. Who is this Wolfe McFarlane? And then, when he had heard the landlord out, it cannot be, he added. And yet I would like to well see him face to face. Do you know him, doctor? Asked the undertaker with a gasp. God forbid, was the reply. And yet, the name is a strange one. It were too much to fancy too. Tell me, landlord, is he old? Well, said the host, he's not a young man, to be sure, and his hair is white, but he looks younger than you. He's older, though, years older, but, with a slap upon the table, it's the rum you see in my face, rum and sin. This man, perhaps, may have an easy conscience and good digestion. Conscience, hear me speak. You would think it was some good old decent Christian, would you not? But no, not I. I never canted. Voltaire might have canted if he stood in my shoes, but the brains, with a rattling fillip on his bald head, the brains were clear and active, and I saw and made no deductions. If you know this doctor, I ventured to remark, after a somewhat awful pause, I should gather that you do not share the landlord's good opinion. Fetz paid no regard to me. Yes, he said with a sudden decision, I must see him face to face. There was another pause, and then a door was closed rather sharply on the first floor, and a step was heard upon the stair. That's the doctor, cried the landlord. Look sharp, and you can catch him. It was but 2 steps from the small parlour to the door of the Old George Inn. The wide oak staircase landed almost in the street. There was room for a turkey rug and nothing more between the threshold and the last round of the descent. But this little space was every evening brilliantly lit up not only by the light upon the stair and the great signal lamp below the sign, but by the warm radiance of the bar-room window. The George thus brightly advertised itself to passers-by in the cold street. Fetz walked steadily to the spot, and we, who were hanging behind, beheld the 2 men met, as one of them had phrased it, face to face. Dr. McFarlane was alert and vigorous. His white hair set off his pale and placid, although energetic countenance. He was richly dressed in the finest broadcloth and the whitest of linen, and with a great gold watch chain with studs and spectacles of the same precious material. He wore a broad-folded tie, white and speckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving coat of fur. There was no doubt but he became his years, breathing as he did of wealth and consideration. And it was a surprising contrast to see our parlour sot, bald, dirty, pimpled, and robed in his old camlet cloak, confront him at the bottom of the stairs. "McFarlane," he said somewhat loudly, more like a herald than a friend. The great doctor pulled up short on the 4th step, as though the familiarity of the address surprised and somewhat shocked his dignity. "Toddy McFarlane," repeated Fetz. The London man almost staggered. He stared for the swiftest of seconds at the man before him, glanced behind him with a sort of scare, and then in a startled whisper, "Fetz?" he said. "You?" "Aye," said the other. "Me. Did you think I was dead too? We are not so easy shut of our acquaintance." "Hush, hush!" exclaimed the doctor. "Hush, hush! This meeting is so unexpected. I can see you are unmanned. I hardly knew you, I confess at first, but I am overjoyed to have this opportunity. For the present, it must be how do you and how goodbye in one, for my fly is waiting, and I must not fail the train. But you see, let me see, yes, you shall give me your address, and we can count on early news of me. We must do something for you, Fetz. I fear you are out at elbows, but we must see to that for Old Lang Syne as once we sang at suppers." "Money!" cried Fetz. "Money from you! The money that I had from you is lying where I cast it in the rain." Dr. McFarlane had talked himself into some measure of superiority and confidence, but the uncommon energy of this refusal cast him back into his first confusion. A horrible, ugly look came and went across his almost venerable countenance. "My dear fellow," he said, "be it as you please. My last thought is to offend you. I would intrude on none. I will leave you my address. However, I do not wish to know the roof that shelters you, interrupted the other. I heard your name. I feared it might be you. I wished to know if, after all, there were a God. I know now that there is none. Begone! He stood in the middle of the rug, between the stair and the doorway, and the great London physician, in order to escape, would be forced to step to one side. It was plain that he hesitated before the thought of this humiliation. White as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles. But while he still paused uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street at this unusual scene, and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlor, huddled by the corner of the bar. The presence of so many witnesses decided him at once to flee. He crouched together, brushing on the wainscot, and made a dart like a serpent, striking for the door. But his tribulation was not yet entirely at an end, for even as he was passing, Fetz clutched him by the arm, and these words came in a whisper, and yet painfully distinct. "Have you seen it again?" The great rich London doctor cried out aloud with a sharp throttling cry. He dashed his questioner across the open space and, with his hands over his head, fled out of the door like a detected thief. Before it had occurred to one of us to make a movement, the fly was already rattling towards the station. The scene was over like a dream, but the dream had left proofs and traces of its passage. Next day the servant found the fine gold spectacles broken on the threshold, and that very night we were all standing breathless by the barroom window, and Fetz at our side, sober, pale, and resolute in look. "God protect us, Mr. Fetz," said the landlord, coming first into possession of his customary senses. "What in the universe is all this? These are strange things you have been saying." Fetz turned towards us. He looked us each in succession in the face. "See if you can hold your tongues," he said. "That man MacFarlane is not safe to cross. Those who have done so already have repented it too late." And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us goodbye and went forth, under the lamp of the hotel, into the black night. We three turned to our places in the parlor, with the big red fire and 4 clear candles, and as we recapitulated what had happened, the first chill of our surprise soon changed into a glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I've known in the Old George. Each man, before we parted, had his theory that he was bound to prove, and none of us had any nearer business in this world than to track out the past of our condemned companion, and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It is no great boast, but I believe I was a better hand at worming out a story than either of my fellows at the George, and perhaps there is now no other man alive who could narrate to you the following foul and unnatural events. In his young days, Fetz studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears and readily details it for its own. He worked little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was in those days well favoured, and pleased by his exterior. There was at that period a certain extramural teacher of anatomy, whom I shall here designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K was then at the top of his vogue. He enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent and address, partly to the incapacity of his rival and university professor. The students at least swore by his name, and Fetz believed himself, and was believed by others, to have laid the foundations of success when he had acquired the favour of this meteorically famous man. Mr. K was a bon vivant as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly allusion no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities Fetz enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator or sub-assistant in his class. In this capacity, the charge of the theatre and lecture room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of the other students, and it was part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time very delicate affair, that he was lodged by Mr. K, in the same wind, and at the last in the same building, with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hand still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before the winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone when they were gone with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber, to repair the abuses of the night and refresh himself for the labors of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of a life thus passed among the ensigns of mortality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest in the fate and fortunes of another, the slave of his own desires and low ambitions. Cold, light, and selfish in the last resort, he had that modicum of prudence, miscalled morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted, besides, a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye service to his employer, Mr. K. For his day of work he indemnified himself by nights of roaring, blackguardly enjoyment, and when that balance had been struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In that large and busy class, the raw material of the anatomists kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K to ask no questions in his dealings with the trade. "They bring the body, we pay the price," he used to say, dwelling on the alliteration, quid pro quo. And again, and somewhat profanely, "Ask no questions," he would tell his assistants, for conscience' sake. There was no understanding that the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had that idea been broached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror. But the lightness of his speech upon so grave a matter was, in itself, an offence against good manners, and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Fetz, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hang-dog abominable looks of the ruffians who came to him before dawn, and putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have 3 branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. One November morning, this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awake all night with a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast, or throwing himself in fury on his bed, and had fallen at last into that profound, uneasy slumber that so often follows on a night of pain. When he awakened by the 3rd or 4th angry repetition of the concerted signal, there was a thin, bright moonshine. It was bitter cold, windy, and frosty. The town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already preluded the noise and busyness of the day. The ghouls had come later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Fetz, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise. He leaned dozing, with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started, and he took 2 steps nearer, with the candle raised. "God Almighty!" he cried. "That is Jane Galbraith!" The men answered nothing, but they shuffled nearer the door. "I know her, I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible you should have got this body fairly." "Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely," said one of the men. But the other looked Fetz darkly in the eyes and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat or to exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted out the sum, and saw his hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks he identified the girl he had jested with the day before. He saw with horror marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There he reflected at length over the discovery he had made, considered soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instructions, and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and at last, in sore perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate supervisor, the class assistant. This was a young doctor, Wolfe McFarlane, a high favorite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had traveled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skillful on the ice or the links with skate or golf club. He dressed with nice audacity, and, to put the finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and a strong trotting horse. With Fetz he was on terms of intimacy. Indeed, their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce, the pair would drive far into the country in McFarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with their booty to the door of the dissecting room. On that particular morning, McFarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fetz heard him and met him on the stairs, told him his story, and showed him the cause of his alarm. McFarlane examined the marks on her body. "Yes," he said with a nod. "It looks fishy." "Well, what should I do?" asked Fetz. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything?" "Least said, soonest mended, I should say." "Someone might recognize her," objected Fetz. "She was as well known as the Castle Rock." "We'll hope not," said McFarlane, "and if anybody does, well, you didn't, don't you see, and there's an end. The fact is, this has been going on too long. Stir up the mud and you'll get Kay into the most unholy trouble. You'll be in shocking box yourself. So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how any one of us would look, or what the devil we should have to say for ourselves in any Christian witness box. For me, you know there's one certain thing, that practically speaking, all of our subjects have been murdered." "McFarlane!" cried Fetz. "Come now," sneered the other, "as if you hadn't suspected it yourself. Suspecting is one thing, and proof is another, yes, I know. And I'm as sorry as you are that this should have come here," tapping the body with his cane. "The next best thing for me is to not recognize it, and," he added coolly, "I don't. You may, if you please. I don't dictate, but I think a man of the world would do as I do, and I may add, I fancy that is what Kay would look for at our hands. The question is, why did he choose us two for his assistants? And I answer, because he didn't want old wives." This was the tone of all others to affect the mind of a lad like Fetz. He agreed to imitate McFarlane. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected, and no one remarked or appeared to recognize her. One afternoon, when his day's work was over, Fetz dropped into a popular tavern and found McFarlane sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark, with coal-black eyes. The cut of his features gave a promise of intellect and refinement which was but feebly realized in his manners, for he proved, upon a nearer acquaintance, coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised, however, a very remarkable control over McFarlane, issued orders like the great Bashaw, became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commented rudely on the servility on which he was obeyed. This most offensive person took a fancy to Fetz on the spot, plied him with drinks, and honored him with unusual confidences on his past career. If a tenth part of what he confessed were true, he was a very loathsome rogue, and the lad's vanity was tickled by the attention of so experienced a man. "I'm a pretty bad fellow myself," the stranger remarked, "but McFarlane is the boy. Toddy McFarlane, I call him. Toddy, order your friend another glass. Or it might be, Toddy, you jump up and shut the door. Toddy hates me," he said again. "Oh yes, Toddy, you do." Don't you call me that confounded name, growled McFarlane. Hear him? Did you ever see the lads play knife? He would like to do that all over my body, remarked the stranger. We medicals have a better way than that, said Fett. When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him. McFarlane looked up sharply, as though this jest were scarcely to his mind. The afternoon passed. Gray, for that was the stranger's name, invited Fetz to join them at dinner, ordered a feast so sumptuous that the tavern was thrown into commotion, and when all was done, commanded McFarlane to settle the bill. It was late before they separated. The man Gray was incapably drunk. McFarlane, sobered by his fury, chewed the cud of the money he had been forced to squander and the slights he had been obliged to swallow. Fetz, with various liquors singing in his head, returned home with devious footsteps and a mind entirely in abeyance. Next day, McFarlane was absent from the class, and Fetz smiled to himself as he imagined him still squiring the intolerable Gray from tavern to tavern. As soon as the hour of liberty had struck, he posted from place to place in quest of his last night's companions. He could find them, however, nowhere, so returned early to his rooms, went early to bed, and slept the sleep of the just. At 4 a.m, he was awakened by the well-known signal. Descending to the door, he was filled with astonishment to find McFarlane with his gig, and in the gig one of the long and ghastly packages with which he was so well acquainted. "What?" he cried. "Have you been out alone? How did you manage?" But McFarlane silenced him roughly, bidding him turn to business. When they had got the body upstairs and laid it on the table, McFarlane made it first as if he were going away. Then he paused and seemed to hesitate, and said, "You had better look at the face," he said, in tones of some constraint. "You had better," he repeated, as Fetz only stared at him in wonder. "But where and how and when did you come by it?" cried the other. "Look at the face," was the only answer. Fetz was staggered. Strange doubts assailed him. He looked from the young doctor to the body, and then back again. At last, with a start, he did as he was bidden. Had he almost expected the sight that met his eyes, and yet the shock was cruel. To see, fixed in the rigidity of death and naked on that coarse layer of sackcloth, the man whom he had left well clad and full of meat and sin upon the threshold of a tavern, awoke, even in the thoughtless Fetz, some of the terrors of the conscience. It was a crastaby which re-echoed in his soul that two whom he had known should have come to lie upon these icy tables. Yet these were only secondary thoughts. His first concern regarded Wolfe. Unprepared for a challenge so momentous, he knew not how to look his comrade in the face. He durst not meet his eye, and he had neither words nor voice at his command. It was McFarlane himself who made the first advance. He came up quietly behind, and laid his hand gently but firmly on the other's shoulder. "Richardson," said he, "may have the head." Now Richardson was a student who had been long anxious for that portion of the human subject to dissect. There was no answer, and the murderer resumed. "Talking of business, you must pay me. Your accounts, you see, must tally." Fetz found a voice, the ghost of his own. "Pay you?" he cried. "Pay you for that?" "Why, yes, of course you must. By all means and on every possible account you must," returned the other. "I dare not give it for nothing. You dare not take it for nothing. It would compromise us both. This is another case like Jane Gibralth's. The more things are wrong, the more we must act as if they are right." "Where does old K keep his money?" "There," answered Fetz hoarsely, pointing to a cupboard in the corner. "Give me the key, then," said the other, calmly, holding out his hand. There was an instant's hesitation, and the die was cast. McFarlane could not suppress a nervous twitch, the infinitesimal mark of an immense relief, as he felt the key between his fingers. He opened the cupboard, brought out pen and ink, and a paper book that stood in one compartment, and separated out the funds in a drawer a sum suitable to the occasion. "Now look here," he said. "There's the payment made. First proof of your good faith, first step to your security. You have now to clinch it by a second. Enter the payment in your book, and then you for your part may defy the devil." The next few seconds were for Fetz an agony of thought, but in balancing his terrors it was the most immediate that triumphed. Any future difficulty seemed almost welcome if he could avoid a present quarrel with McFarlane. He set down the candle with which he had been carrying all this time, and with a steady hand entered the date, the nature, and the amount of the transaction. "And now," said McFarlane, "it's only fair that you should pocket the lucre. I've had my share already, by the by, when a man of the world falls into a bit of luck, has a few shillings extra in his pocket. I'm ashamed to speak of it, but there's a rule of conduct in the case. No treating, no purchase of expensive class books, no squaring of old debts. Borrow, don't lend." "McFarlane," began Fetz, still somewhat hoarsely, "I have put my neck in a halter to oblige you." "To oblige me?" cried Wolfe. "Oh, come, you did, as near as I can see the matter, what you downright had to do in self-defense. Suppose I got into trouble, where would you be? This second little matter flows clearly from the first. Mr. Grey is the continuation of Miss Gibralth. I can't believe you can't begin and then stop. If you begin, you must keep on beginning. That's the truth. No rest for the wicked." A horrible sense of blackness and the treachery of fate seized hold upon the soul of the unhappy student. "My God!" he cried. "But what have I done? And when did I begin? To be made a class assistant? In the name of reason, where's the harm in that? Service wanted the position. Service might have gotten it. Would he have been where I am now?" "My dear fellow," said McFarlane, "what a boy you are. What harm has come to you? What harm can come to you if you hold your tongue? Why, man, do you know what this life is? There are two squads of us, the lions and the lambs. If you're a lamb, you'll come to lie upon these tables like Grey or Jane Gibralth. If you're a lion, you'll live and drive a horse like me, like Kay, like all the world with any wit or courage. You're staggered at the first, but look at Kay. My dear fellow, you're clever, you have pluck. I like you, and Kay likes you. You were born to lead the hunt. And I tell you, on my honor and my experience of life, 3 days from now, you'll laugh at all these scarecrows like a high school boy at a farce." And with that, McFarlane took his departure and drove up the wind in his gig to get under cover before daylight. Fetz was thus left alone with his regrets. He saw the miserable peril in which he stood involved. He saw, with inexpressible dismay, that there was no limit to his weakness, and that, from concession to concession, he had fallen from the arbiter of McFarlane's destiny to his paid and helpless accomplice. He would have given the world to have been a little braver at the time, but it did not occur to him that he might still be brave. The secret of Jane Gibralth and the cursed entry in the daybook closed his mouth. Hours passed. The class began to arrive. The members of the unhappy Grey were dealt out to one another and received without remark. Richardson was made happy with the head, and before the hour of freedom rang, Fetz trembled with exultation to perceive how far they had already gone toward safety. For 2 days he continued to watch, with increasing joy, the dreadful process of disguise. On the 3rd day McFarlane made his appearance. He'd been ill, he said, but he made up for lost time by the energy with which he directed the students. To Richardson in particular he extended the most valuable assistance and advice, and that student, encouraged by the praise of the demonstrator, burned high with ambitious hopes and saw the medal already in his grasp. Before the week was out, McFarlane's prophecy had been fulfilled. Fetz had outlived his terrors and forgotten his baseness. He began to plume himself upon his courage, and had so arranged the story in his mind that he could look back on these events with an unhealthy pride. Of his accomplice he saw but little. They met, of course, in the business of the class. They received their orders together from Mr. K. At times they had a word or two in private, and McFarlane was from first to last particularly kind and jovial. But it was plain that he avoided any reference to their common secret, and even when Fetz whispered to him that he had cast in his lot with the lions and forsworn the lambs, he only signed to him smilingly to hold his peace. At length an occasion arose which threw the pair once more into a closer union. Mr. K was again short of subjects. Pupils were eager, and it was a part of his teacher's pretensions to be always well supplied. At the same time, there came the news of a burial in the rustic graveyard of Glencorse. Time has little changed the place in question. It stood then, as now, upon a crossroad, out of call of human habitations, and buried fathom deep in the foliage of 6 cedar trees. The cries of the sheep upon the neighboring hills, the streamlets upon either hand, one loudly singing among pebbles, the other dripping furtively from pond to pond. The stir of the wind in mountainous old flowering chestnuts, and once in 7 days the voice of the bell and the old tunes of the precentor were the only sounds that disturbed the silence around the rural church. The resurrected man, to use a byname of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was part of his trade to despise and desecrate the scrolls and trumpets of old tombs, the paths worn by the feet of worshippers and mourners, and the offerings and the inscriptions of bereaved affection. To rustic neighborhoods where love is more than commonly tenacious, and where some bonds of blood or fellowship unite the entire society of a parish, the body snatcher, far from being repelled by natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task. To bodies that had been laid in earth, in joyful expectation of a far different awakening, there came that hasty, lamplit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. The coffin was forced, the cerements torn, and the melancholy relics clad in sackcloth, after being rattled for hours on moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities before a class of gaping boys. Somewhat as two vultures may swoop upon a dying lamb, Fetz and MacFarlane were to be let loose upon a grave in that green and quiet resting place. The wife of a farmer, a woman who had lived for 60 years, and been known for nothing but good butter and godly conversation, was to be rooted from her grave at midnight and carried, dead and naked, to that faraway city that she had always honored with her Sunday's best. The place beside her family was to be empty till the crack of doom, her innocent and almost venerable members to be exposed to that last curiosity of the anatomist. Late one afternoon, the pair set forth, well wrapped in cloaks and furnished with a formidable bottle. It rained without remission, a cold, dense, lashing rain. Now and again there blew a puff of smoke, and these winds in these sheets of falling water kept it down. Bottle and all, it was a sad and silent drive as far as Penicuik, where they were to spend the evening. They stopped once to hide their implements in a thick bush not far from the churchyard, and once again at the Fisher's Tryst to have a toast before the kitchen fire, and vary their nips of whiskey with a glass of ale. When they reached their journey's end, the gig was housed, the horse was fed and comforted, and the two young doctors in a private room sat together at the best dinner and the best wine the house afforded. The lights, the fire, the beating rain upon the window, the cold, incongruous work that laid before them, added zest to their enjoyment of the meal. With every glass, their cordiality increased. Soon MacFarlane handed a little pile of gold to his companion. A compliment, he said. Between friends, these little accommodations ought to fly like pipe lights. Fetz pocketed the money and applauded the sentiment to the echo. "You are a philosopher," he cried. "I was an ass till I knew you. You and Kay, between you, by the Lord Harry, but you'll make a man of me." "Of course we shall," applauded MacFarlane. "A man? I tell you, it required a man to back me up the other morning. There are some big, brawling 40-year-old cowards who would have turned sick at the look of the dead thing, but not you. You kept your head. I watched you." "Well, and why not?" Fetz thus vaunted himself. "It was no affair of mine. There was nothing to gain on the one side but disturbance, and on the other I could count on your gratitude, don't you see?" And he slapped his pocket till the gold pieces rang. MacFarlane somehow felt a certain touch of alarm at these unpleasant words. He may have regretted that he had taught his young companion so successfully, but he had no time to interfere, for the other noisily continued in this boastful strain. "The great thing is not to be afraid. Now, between you and me, I don't want to hang. That's practical, but all for cant. MacFarlane, I was born with a contempt. Hell, God, devil, right, wrong, sin, crime, and all the old gallery of curiosities. They might frighten boys, but men of the world, like you and me, despise them. Here's to the memory of Grey." It was by this time growing somewhat late. The gig, according to order, was brought round to the door with both lamps brightly shining, and the young men had to pay their bill and take the road. They announced they were bound for Peebles, and drove in that direction till they were clear of the last house of the town. then, extinguishing the lamps, returned upon their course and followed a by-road toward Glencorse. There was no sound but that of their own passage and the incessant, strident pouring of the rain. It was pitch dark. Here and there a white gate or white stone in the wall guided them for a short space across the night, but for the most part it was at a foot pace, and almost groping, that they picked their way through that resonant blackness to their solemn and isolated destination. In the sunken woods that traversed the neighborhood of the burying ground, the last glimmer failed them, and it became necessity to kindle a match and re-illuminate one of the lanterns of the gig. Thus, under the dripping trees and environed by huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labors. They were both experienced in such affairs, and powerful with the spade, and they had scarce been 20 minutes at their task before they were rewarded by a dull rattle on the coffin lid. At the same moment, MacFarlane, having hurt his hand upon a stone, flung it carelessly above his head. The grave, in which they now stood almost to the shoulders, was close to the edge of the plateau of the graveyard, and the gig lamp had been propped, the better to illuminate their labors, against a tree, and on the immediate verge of the steep bank descending to the stream. Chance had taken a sure aim with the stone, then came a clang of broken glass. Night fell upon them. Sounds alternately dull and ringing announced the bounding of the lantern down the bank and its occasional collision with the trees. A stone or two, which it had dislodged in its descent, rattled behind it into the profundities of the glen, and then silence, like night, resumed its sway, and they might bend their hearing to its utmost pitch, but naught was to be heard except the rain, now marching to the wind, now steadily falling over miles of open country. They were so nearly at an end of their abhorrent task that they judged it wisest to complete it in the dark. The coffin was exhumed and broken open, the body inserted in the dripping sack, and carried between them to the gig. One mounted to keep it in its place, and the other, taking horse by the mouth, groped along by wall and bush until they reached the wider road by the Fisher's Tryst. It was a faint, diffused radiancy which they hailed like daylight. By that they pushed the horse to a good place, and began to rattle along merrily in the direction of the town. They had both been wetted to the skin during their operations, and now, as the gig jumped among the deep ruts, the thing that stood propped between them fell now upon one and now upon the other. At every repetition of the horrid contact, each instinctively repelled it with the greater haste, and the process, natural although it was, began to tell upon the nerves of the companions. MacFarlane made some ill-favoured jest about the farmer's wife, but it became hollow from his lips and was allowed to drop in silence. Still their unnatural burden bumped from side to side, and now the head would be laid, as if in confidence, upon their shoulders, and now the drenching sackcloth would flap icily about their faces. A creeping chill began to possess the soul of Fetz. He peered at the bundle, and it seemed somehow larger than at first. All over the countryside, and from every degree of distance, the farm dogs accompanied their passage with tragic ululations, and it grew and grew upon his mind that some unnatural miracle had been accomplished, that some nameless change had befallen the dead body, and that it was in fear of their whole unholy burden that the dogs were howling. "For God's sake," he said, making a great effort to arrive at speech, "for God's sake, let's have a light." Seemingly, MacFarlane was affected in the same direction, for, though he made no reply, he stopped the horse, passed the reins to his companion, got down, and proceeded to kindle the remaining lamp. They had by that time got no farther than the crossroad down to Auchenclinny. The rain still poured as though the deluge were returning, and it was no easy matter to make a light in such a world of wet and darkness. When at last the flickering blue flame had been transferred to the wick and began to expand and clarify, and shed a wide circle of misty brightness round the gig, it became possible for the two young men to see each other and the thing they had along with them. The rain had moulded the rough sack to the outlines of the body underneath. The head was distinct from the trunk, the shoulders plainly modelled. Something at once spectral and human riveted their eyes upon the ghastly comrade of their drive. For some time MacFarlane stood motionless, holding up the lamp. A nameless dread was swathed like a wet sheet about the body, and tightened the white skin upon the face of Fetz. A fear that was a horror of what he could not be, kept mounting to his brain. Another beat of the watch, and he had spoken, but his comrade forestalled him. "That is not a woman," said McFarlane, in a hushed voice. "It was a woman when we put her in," whispered Fetz. "Hold that lamp," said the other. "I must see her face." And as Fetz took the lamp, his companion untied the fastenings of the sack and drew down the cover from the head. The light fell very clear upon the dark, well-molded features and smooth-shaven cheeks of a too familiar countenance often beheld in dreams of both these young men. A wild yell rang up into the night. Each leaped from his own side into the roadway. The lamp fell, broke, and was extinguished, and the horse, terrified by this unusual commotion, bounded and went off towards Edinburgh at a gallop, bearing along with it the sole occupant of the gig, the body of the dead and long dissected Grey. Dun dun dun. Definitely not something I should do for 3 hours at a time. Also, thank you, Kason, for the raid. Hello, Starcat. Hello, Mrs. Wells Knight. Oh my god, see? I start hiccuping as soon as I stop reading. Horror stories are the answer. So loud. Why are you so loud? Oh, I hear a kitty cat playing with a tinkly ball. Yeah, that's gonna be it from me for tonight. I definitely enjoy reading stories, but I feel like I did a not very good job because, especially by the end, I was pushing myself just to finish, and my throat is killing me. But hopefully there's something worthwhile in that VOD and in those wave files that we've recorded. Hopefully people enjoyed. It sounds like I'm gonna go play with a kitty cat. Yeah, definitely something different. Definitely interested in doing more story time stuff, but I might just do it like one story at a time kind of thing. You know, like not 3 hours. And then I can just put my full energy into it, or, you know, at least, you know, I don't know. My throat's killing me, so I definitely need to just stop. And tomorrow might not involve a lot of talking. We'll see. I guess I have to go to the outro screen because I didn't. Oh, I could put the credits here, right? I can do that. Yeah. Bam. Thank you everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I have to undo all the things I did to my stream for tomorrow. Thank you Squarker and Steph for the resubs. And thank you Anonymous for the biddies. Yeah, no, I definitely... If you were following along, you would have heard me trying to make up for mistakes and just rolling with it because it was better than just going back and restating the actual words. Yes. Thank you for watching. Who are we gonna raid? I don't know. Whatever, man. I don't know. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you all tomorrow with something less spooky. Good night.